Well, I was talking before about this whole concept of seeing people on the ballot and not believing that they're not already in, right? And I think Gorilla might be at the very top of that list or close to it. And you talked about Greg, you were talking about the bias against JYD, and we all know Gorilla Monsoon won worst announcer of the year in the Observer, something like 6 or 7 times. It is a record. Michael Cole has a chance of beating it in his career. I'm not kidding, but it's a record. And so that I think that biases people. Now, he fell off the ballot in 2015 for not getting enough votes. He was put back on. Dave told me specifically because of this book, just to give it a chance and to see what happens. I predict he's going to go in a landslide. Some of that is because of nostalgia and reappraisals over the years. You have a lot of voters now who grew up with him, even wrestlers who grew up with him and were influenced by his calls. But I want to focus on, since he's in the non wrestler category, I didn't want to talk too much about his wrestling credentials. However, about that, I'll just say I would even, and I'm glad that Dave, by the way, didn't put him in on both, because then he would have canceled himself out and probably not gone in, to put him in the historical category. However, I would actually say that even if he would just put in on the historical wrestler category, I think he would still deserve to go in based on what he did. Because one thing is, I look at this Hall of Fame, and I don't know if I'm supposed to look at it this way. It's hard for me to look at it as a strictly sports Hall of Fame, like say the baseball or boxing, where you're only looking at numbers and things, you're only looking at stats. Look, professional wrestling is and has for a very, very long time, before any of us were born, been also a huge part of it show business, entertainment, even when they didn't admit that it was. That's partly what it was. So I tend to look at it more like something like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where some of it is you're looking at the intangibles, you're looking at how entertaining they were, how what a big name they were as a performer. And so for me, like Gorilla Monsoon in that category, you're talking about one of the most famous wrestling names of all time. You're talking about a guy who, was Bruno Sammartino's arguably greatest rival in the ring, 7 main events at Madison Square Garden. I would have to say, even if you're talking numbers, and this is even based on Dave's numbers, I think in 1963 and 4, he might have been the top drawing heel in wrestling. And certainly in 65, 7, and 8, I think it would have been the Sheik, but he would have been right up there on the short list. And so for things like that, I think he should already go in as a wrestler. But for the non wrestling stuff, you're talking about somebody who was a cornerstone in a very real sense, not just in a respectful, admiring way, in a very real way, a cornerstone of the company that's now and has for a long time been the biggest, most successful wrestling promotion in the history of the world. And he was one of the foundation members. He owned a quarter of it at one point, and it wasn't just a no-show job. He was running television. He was the crucial linchpin of WWF week-to-week TV production from about 1970 until Vince Jr. took over. And even at that point, he was still highly influential in a real way behind the scenes from at least 1984 until probably basically the end of the 80s. And then his health started to fail. And at that point, he was more just basically an on air talent. Now, to focus on that as a commentator, again, you want to talk about a reappraisal. I tend to think, and I try to say this in kind ways, I'm not a confrontational person. I'm not a arguments. I always try to defuse. But I think we have smart fan opinions, these newsletter fan opinions that are taken for granted is a tiny, minuscule portion of the fan base. And you have to get outside the bubble. And what I mean by that is to say, to the average wrestling fan who grew up in the 80s and 90s watching the WWF, if you said to them, 9 out of 10 of them, if you said to them, oh, Gorilla Monsoon, God, wasn't he horrible? They would think you were out of your mind. Right. They would think you were out of your mind because he was so cherished as a commentator and so respected and loved. And not only that, but he wasn't just respected and loved in a Phil Rizzuto kind of way. Like, he did his job so well. He called it like a sport. He called it in a way that put over the talent, but at the same time did not give up his own credibility and reputation like a lot of wrestling commentators do, where everything is the greatest of all time and no one ever makes a mistake and every match is 5 stars. He didn't do that. And I think that made him some enemies, which, according to Dave, that's part of the issue. It made him some enemies in the locker room who thought he was burying them on commentary. And those people would complain behind the scenes. But I think, and by every category of what he did in a non wrestling capacity, whether it was as part owner of the company, TV producer, a promoter in his own right, running Eastern Pennsylvania, North Jersey, Delaware area, his own, I'm sorry, South Jersey, Jersey Shore, things like that, plus the commentary stuff that people saw, is to me makes him not even a question, not even a question that this person should be in there. And I hope that most people that vote this time around will look at that ballot and have the same reaction I had years ago when I first saw it, which is, how is he not in there already? We have to fix this.